To help us understand this a little bit more, I'd like to introduce Miss Maureen de la Cruz, National IOM Project Manager for the Climate Change Adaptation and Community Resilience in the Philippines program. A little bit about Maureen. In addition to her career in the development and humanitarian sector, Maureen is also a human rights lawyer. Her fieldwork gives her opportunities to be deeply involved with communities who feel the cutting impact of the climate emergency. So, as you'll see, this issue is very personal to Maureen. And as a little bit of trivia, Maureen was once upon a time also a media practitioner. Maureen continues to publish creative writing pieces occasionally, and is also familiar with the issue of telling stories about climate crisis and emergencies from a storytelling lens. Maureen will give us an overview of environmental migration. Maureen?
Thank you so much, Anna, and thank you everyone for joining us today on this very timely topic. Very glad that you could all join this webinar this afternoon. So as mentioned, I'll be sharing a bit about human mobility and the climate crisis. Why are we talking about the linkages between these two in the first place? And to spark some ideas about how storytellers, content creators, reporters, and journalists could contribute to raising public awareness about this global issue. So since we are all interested in or are in the business of telling stories, and this effort is all about focusing on human narratives of climate change, the stories behind the data, I'd like to open my presentation actually with a bit of a personal perspective as well. If we could have the next slide, Jessica, please. Okay, so yeah, I myself came from a lakeside community. I'm originally from San Pedro, Laguna. Barangay Landayan is right on the shores of um, Laguna de Bai. So this was a photo I took immediately after Typhoon Paeng. The day after the typhoon, I went home to our barangay. And as you can see, this is right outside our house, right in front of the street in front of our house. It's flooded, and we are a community that frequently experiences displacement due to flooding. Every time there's a typhoon, we either have to stay in our flooded houses or move elsewhere. Um, Now, this is not only a story of natural disasters or of the climate crisis, but also a story of mobility and migration. So aside from sometimes having to move for days or weeks at a time to evacuate once the water gets into our houses, and I'm sure a lot of other Filipinos can also relate to this. Some of us have been internally displaced at one point or another, especially after disasters. Um, but also, there are other migration patterns that are linked to the global climate crisis. Um, so actually in the photo, you can see our neighbor is actually my compare. His youngest daughter is my inaanak. So let's call him Joey. Their family used to make their living through fishing. His father was a fisherman. But as with many other towns in the Philippines, when urbanization set in, when San Pedro became a city, the next generation moved to other forms of livelihood. Joey he works as a tricycle driver, and one of his brothers has actually worked abroad in Saudi Arabia as an OFW. His daughter also aspires to be an OFW, and one of the reasons behind that is to save money for the family in order to build basically a more climate resilient, disaster resilient house for their family. That's their aspiration. um, the daughter now wants to work abroad, so that they have funds to rebuild the damaged house, which has been repeatedly buffeted by typhoons, and also to strengthen it so that their family can survive future disasters. So this is just, of course, there are many other more compelling stories, but just to show that, almost everyone in the Philippines has a narrative to tell, has some experience in one way or another of disasters, and mobility as an impact of climate change or as an adaptation strategy for many households and many families. So let's move to the next slide, please. So how is migration connected to climate change? Just to sum up, many of the very insightful answers that you shared in chat in response to the question asked by Anna earlier. As mentioned by Yuko, we just had COP27 last month in November. Ahead of this major activity, the a working group of the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change has actually published a report this February. It's called Climate Change 2022: Impacts, Adaptation, and Vulnerability. So it emphasized that climate change is a threat to human well-being and health of the planet. It really affects our very existence as humanity, as inhabitants of planet Earth. Now, what is the link between this and migration or human mobility? So environmental change impacts people on the move, whether we're talking about people displaced by disaster, those moving internally, whether for work because of the economic challenges that a family has faced, because of repeated experiences of displacement, or even those migrating internationally. Despite this, human mobility in the context of climate change is still so far just being newly considered as an emerging thematic area when it comes to finding solutions, crafting responsive policies, or making budgetary decisions. So this whole issue needs to be translated into adequate policies, finance, solutions, concerted action by all actors involved. So let's have the next slide. Just to share some global trends, basically, that really highlight the link between human mobility and climate change. So usually when we talk about climate change or the climate crisis, first thing that comes to mind is the impact of disasters. So just in 2021, throughout that whole year, according to the Internal Displacement Monitoring Center's latest report, there were 23.7 million incidents of internal displacement. And the highest number is in the East Asia and the Pacific region, which includes the Philippines. So 13.7 million of these internal displacements were actually in our region. Most climate related migration and displacement currently takes place within countries. Although, of course, there are people who also move outside of their respective countries' borders for climate related reasons. And this trend is projected to continue. Up to 216 million people could move within their countries by 2050, including 49 million in East Asia and the Pacific. So this was a projection that was mentioned in a landmark study by the World Bank published in 2021. And all of these linkages really point to the need for coherence between the migration agenda or migration management and thematic areas such as sustainable development, climate action, and disaster risk reduction. So usually when we think of the environment, we think of scientific research or community-based adaptation measures, um, but also human mobility cuts across all of these issues. Therefore, what IOM would like to stress through conversations like this is really the need for greater coherence in the policy agenda, in public communications, and in climate action generally, in really considering migration or human mobility as an important dimension of both the impacts of climate change and also of the adaptation practices adopted by affected communities. So to move to the next slide, how is this relevant to the Philippines? So we all know that climate change is a global phenomenon. But for the Philippines, it's even more particularly important. A striking fact is that 7 out of the 25 cities worldwide that are most exposed to a sea level rise of 1 meter are actually in the country. There are 7 cities across Luzon, Visayas, and Mindanao that are in the top 25. Being an archipelagic country, 63% of our population live along coastlines, which means that almost 7 million individuals are at risk of displacement, whether temporary or permanent relocation or temporary internal displacement due to rising sea levels. As we all know as well, 7 out of 10 of the most destructive typhoons in the country happened during the last decade, and nearly 650,000 persons yearly are at risk of displacement from typhoons, flood, and storm surges. So, in short, thousands, if not millions, of Filipinos are at risk in terms of their lives, their livelihoods, their traditional ways of life, and also their communities. Are at risk of being affected in one way or another by environmental phenomena, including both sudden onset disasters and slow onset climate shifts. Um, Lastly, the Philippines is the eighth country that is most at risk worldwide from a 4 degrees Celsius increase in temperature. So the science bears it out. As Yuko mentioned earlier, that the latest World Risk Report actually put the Philippines at #1 already as of this year in terms of climate risks. Therefore, knowing that we are one of the countries most affected worldwide by this issue, yeah, we can move to the next one. Um, what we'd like to focus on especially are who are the humans behind the data, um, which sectors are most vulnerable to climate impacts. So as we've seen, almost everyone has a stake in this global climate emergency, but in particular, the stories that need to be told are the experiences of the communities directly impacted. And from a study that was published last year by IOM Philippines through the Climate Change Adaptation and Community Resilience Project, or CARP, which is also organizing this webinar, there were particular sectors of Filipinos who are most vulnerable to climate impacts. So these include farmers and fisher folk, women. 80% of people displaced by the climate emergency are actually women. So there is definitely a gender dimension to this issue. Older persons are also more vulnerable due to physical constraints when they have to move, and also sometimes there are specific roles in their families and communities. Those who are among the urban poor are also more vulnerable to climate impacts, especially those living in coastal areas. So the next slide shows how does the climate emergency manifest itself to Filipinos? What are the patterns that we most commonly observe or that are top of mind when Filipinos are asked about the impact of the global climate crisis? So usually the discussions focus on rapid onset events like storm surges, typhoons, and floods. Less directly observable, of course, because their impacts are felt over a longer period of time, are the slow onset climate changes. But in particular, the effects really make themselves felt on livelihoods. So especially among farmers and fisher folk, um, usually they would describe, and we've been going around in several communities as part of our field work in this project, that is really validated by the feedback that we receive from people in places as diverse as Bulacan to Zamboanga to Cotabato City. Um, Communities actually observe changes such as depleted fish stocks for fishing communities, or for those engaged in seaweed farming, it's harder for them to sustain their livelihoods and actually harvest a sufficient quantity of seaweed and of good quality as well to be able to break even in terms of what they spent in farming. So it's really impacting people's livelihoods and does have um, trickle down effects across their family members and also their communities. And sometimes that's a dimension that goes unexplored. For example, when we talk about labor migration, we usually talk about the economic reasons for making the decision to go abroad to work as an OFW. But if we probe further, it's actually possible, and we're starting to see that pattern from the inputs we've had through our community dialogues that we're organizing. Um, that often those communities, the economic challenges that pushed them to make those decisions to migrate for work were actually rooted in repeated experiences, repeated cycles of displacement, which exacerbated their financial challenges, and thus one or more family members um, had to leave the country to work. So there's also a correlation. Sorry. Yeah. There's also a correlation to increase of rain, drought, loss of crops, and resource scarcity to the seasonal rise in recruitment of rebel groups. The conflict climate nexus is also one dimension that really needs more research and more focused action. Um, Many of the project areas that we've included in our ongoing climate change interventions for IOM are also actually conflict affected communities. So as a field worker, I have personally observed instances like, for example, people are already in evacuation centers, like after the Marawi crisis in 2017, and then a typhoon came and flooded those same evacuation sites. So the, the displaced families were again displaced a second time, this time due to the typhoon, after being displaced by a conflict. Lastly, climate impacts cascade on various facets of a person's life. So it has impacts on health, access to shelter, education. Um, Basically, all of a family's basic needs can be affected, and this gives rise to other protection risks. So for humanitarian and development workers, there's a need for us to start looking more closely into issues such as the vulnerability of communities displaced by disasters, to risks such as trafficking in persons or illegal recruitment, even the rise of gender-based violence in displaced communities. So there are really a multitude of impacts in the way that the climate emergency manifests itself to Filipinos, and it's not just limited to failed crops or houses destroyed by flooding, but can really impact all aspects of a person's life or a household's day-to-day living. So next slide, please. So just to ground our discussion today and the rest of our inputs from our speakers for this afternoon, we're just drawing attention to a few core concepts in terms of how we look at migration or human mobility and its relationship to environmental phenomena. So, what is migration? We've covered why we're talking about migration in relation to climate change in the first place, but the definition of migration that we're using in our discussion for IOM, it's the movement of a person or group of persons, whether it's across international borders or within the same country. So it's actually a broader encompassing definition of migration, in the sense of a population movement, regardless of the lens of the movement, um, the profiles of the people affected, or the cause. So that means this can include movements of refugees, internally displaced persons, economic or labor migrants, and even people moving for other purposes such as family reunification. So all of these are forms of human mobility. And many of these, not all of these, could be either a direct effect, a direct or indirect effect of climate-related disasters, or can be adaptation measures practiced by communities to cope with the impacts of climate change. Hence, the strong connection between the two topics. So for the next slide, um, this actually broadens our understanding of what are we talking about when we discuss environmental migration. So what are the environmental phenomena that we're looking at? Actually, they can be naturally occurring or human made. So again, as I mentioned earlier, usually the top of mind are disasters, environmental events that are most cases sudden, but sometimes also slow onset. So they usually take weeks or months. But in the case of, for example, storm surges or tsunamis, it can literally be a matter of minutes. Um, Another dimension are the environmental processes. So this is what we usually think of as environmental change, which includes climate change, which take place over longer time scales, usually decades or even longer. So these are phenomena like sea level rise and desertification. So our discussion on environmental migration actually encompasses all of these different phenomena. So not just the sudden onset disasters, but also the slower and longer processes over time that we may not directly observe even in our lifetimes, but still impact the habitability of certain areas of human habitats in general. Environmental stressors and natural or man-made hazards do not always lead to disasters, and it's also recognized that disasters occur because of several factors, such as your risk exposure and also your capacities for risk management. So it doesn't mean that just because flooding hasn't happened or a community was able to withstand a typhoon doesn't mean that the risk doesn't exist. So next slide. So, well, connecting those two concepts, who then is an environmental migrant? So IOM's proposed definition of this is that the term environmental migrant would refer to a person or group of persons who, due to sudden or progressive changes in the environment, um, which has an impact, adversely affects their lives or their living conditions, are obliged to leave their homes or choose to do so. So whether we're talking, forced displacement or voluntary migration, like in the case of labor migration of OFWs, and whether it's temporary or permanent, but there is movement, and the reason is linked to the changes in the environment and to its impact on their day-to-day lives and their livelihoods. So again, quite an encompassing definition to broaden our understanding of the link between mobility and climate change. Um, Also, just to frame this, that what are the reasons why people move, right? Um, Essentially, the core reason is that parts of the Earth, parts of the planet become less habitable. Whether it's temporarily, in some cases, people are able to return after disasters, or sometimes it's simply unsustainable for them to stay in their usual places of residence. And so there's relocation that people move either voluntarily or the government facilitates resettlement. But these are due to different factors, which are all related to environmental phenomena. So you have climate change, and other phenomena like water pollution, desertification, and deterioration of agricultural lands. So all of this can trigger mobility, or people may resort to mobility in order to cope with the degrading quality of their normal habitats or residences. So in that sense, what does environmental migration look like? It has many phases. And tomorrow, actually, in day two, we'll go a bit more in depth into what are the stories, what are the forms that environmental migration can take, and also what are the adaptation measures that are practiced by many of the communities. So, environmental migration can be either forced or voluntary. It may be temporary or permanent. People may move to places near to their residence or more far off to cope with the impacts of the disaster. Or and Between vulnerability and resilience, there's usually a continuum, and this can be analyzed both at individual level and also at community level and even at country level. And tomorrow we'll also look more into the relationship between this and other factors such as gender or livelihood sector, which would affect the vulnerability of households or persons. Um, to the impacts of environmental migration. So there are different factors that can influence a community's resilience. And obviously, I mean, for Filipinos, the word resilience has been very much heard and in some senses overused over the past several decades as we cope with repeated disasters. But our hope is that within this continuum of vulnerability to resilience, our communities, our families, and we as individuals, as Filipinos, would move more towards the resilience end of the spectrum and knowing about adaptation measures, understanding not only the science behind climate change, but also the linkages between the climate crisis and human mobility, would just equip us with more information to boost our resilience. And telling stories, drawing attention to the human narratives of the climate crisis is one way of really raising this awareness. And so that's why we're having this webinar series, and we're very glad that you joined us. Our hope is that you contribute to this effort by um, creating your own stories, creating content, using your creativity to highlight this issue for Filipinos and also at a global level. So that's it for my presentation. In case you have any questions, even after the webinar, I've shared my email address here. You can reach out to IOM through me if any of you are interested in our materials that you can use as references for creating content, or you're a media practitioner and would like to collaborate with IOM in producing stories. So do feel free to reach out, and thank you so much. I'll be on hand to take questions after the inputs of the other speakers. Salamat.
Thank you very much, Maureen, for your personal sharing to open up this webinar. I think what you showed us, the pictures of Joey, your neighbor, and also his daughters, your inaanak. It's a very personal story of how our personal lives intertwine with the climate crisis. At the same time, you also brought us to the science of all of this, right? 7 out of 25 cities worldwide that are exposed to a sea level rise of about 1 meter are found in the Philippines. So this is, yes, climate crisis is very much in our reality, in our backyard, but also very, very urgent. I don't think these are things that we haven't heard before, but it always bears to be repeated. I think also to highlight, Maureen, what you said, that the climate crisis impacts us not just through, the immediate emergency, but the livelihoods of people is what is immediately affected. And as we can see from Joey, he was an OFW or a migrant worker, and then his daughter now thinks about becoming a migrant worker. There's definitely that connection between the climate crisis and migration, but there's also multiple factors like conflict, armed conflict in certain areas that experience this. And over a lifetime of a person, they can experience the displacement and how displacement affects your decision to move or to not move. Over a period of your life, it can happen more than once. Okay, that's thanks, Maureen, for setting up the foundation of the different lens of how we should think about or can think about climate crisis and migration.